Hello everyone. Welcome back to Midnight Murmurs tonight. I'll be your storyteller, guiding you through chilling accounts that were never meant to be uncovered. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more true horror stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Because once you hear these stories, you might never look at the dark the same way again. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled into the narrow dirt driveway, my headlights cutting through the thick Appalachian fog that clung to the mountainside like a living thing. I'd been driving for hours through winding back roads that seemed to fold in on themselves, past coal-scarred hillsides and abandoned mining towns that time had forgotten. The cabin emerged from the mist like something out of a fever dream. Weathered logs, dark with age, a sagging porch that groaned under the weight of decades, and windows that reflected nothing but black emptiness back at me. This was supposed to be my escape. My chance to disconnect from the chaos of city life and find some peace in these ancient mountains. I'd booked it online for dirt cheap, which should have been my first warning. The photos had made it look rustic and charming, but standing here now with the engine ticking as it cooled, I felt something else entirely. The silence was wrong, too complete, too heavy, as if the very air was holding its breath. I grabbed my overnight bag and approached the front door, each step echoing strangely in the stillness. The key was exactly where the owner had said it would be, under a loose floorboard that squealed when I lifted it. As I fumbled with the old lock, I could have sworn I heard something. A whisper, soft and barely audible, carried on the mountain wind. It sounded almost like my name, but that was impossible. Nobody knew I was here. The inside of the cabin felt even smaller than it looked from the outside, with low-beam ceilings that seemed to press down on me like the weight of the mountain itself. I flipped the light switch and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows that danced across walls lined with relics from a bygone era. Mason jars filled with unidentifiable preserved things sat on crooked shelves, their contents floating in murky liquid like specimens in some backwoods laboratory. Old hunting traps hung from rusty nails, their teeth still sharp enough to draw blood. But it was the symbols carved into the wooden beams that really caught my attention. They weren't decorative. These were deep, deliberate cuts gouged into the wood with something sharp and desperate. Some looked vaguely familiar, like Cherokee markings I'd seen in museums, while others seemed to writhe in the flickering light, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. I ran my fingers along one of the deeper carvings, feeling the rough edges where someone had worked frantically to complete whatever message they were trying to leave behind. As night settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, I tried to make myself at home. I'd brought enough food for the weekend and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, thinking this would be the perfect opportunity to unwind. The cabin's silence was broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant call of something that might have been an owl, though it sounded wrong somehow, too human in its cadence. Midnight came and went, marked only by the old grandfather clock in the corner that wheezed out 12 ominous chimes. That's when the whispers started in earnest. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind finding its way through gaps in the old logs. But as I lay in the narrow bed with my eyes squeezed shut, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The voices were calling my name, not just one voice, but several, layered over each other like a chorus of the damned. "Sarah," they whispered from somewhere deep within the walls. "Sarah, we've been waiting." The voices were different, some old and raspy, others young and pleading, but they all knew me somehow. They spoke about things only I would know. Childhood memories and secret fears I'd never shared with anyone. Sleep became impossible as the whispers grew bolder, more insistent until I was sitting bolt upright in bed, staring at walls that seemed to pulse with each spoken word, as if the cabin itself had developed a heartbeat. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. I'd spent the remaining hours until sunrise huddled in the corner chair, watching the walls and waiting for the voices to return. But they'd fallen silent with the first gray light filtering through the grimy windows. My hands shook as I made coffee with water from the rusty tap, desperate for something normal to ground me in reality. The rational part of my mind kept insisting I'd imagined it all, that isolation and stress had finally gotten to me. But the memory of those voices speaking my deepest secrets was too vivid to dismiss. I needed answers, and the only place to find them was in town. The drive down the winding mountain road took 20 minutes, past trailer homes and abandoned coal tipples that stood like skeletal monuments to a dead industry. The town of Millfield was barely more than a gas station, a diner, and a small library housed in what used to be a company store. The librarian, a weathered woman named Betty who looked like she'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains, eyed me suspiciously when I asked about the cabin. "You're staying up at the Hartwell place?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Lord have mercy, child. Ain't nobody told you the history of that cursed ground?" She led me to a back room filled with dusty local records and newspaper clippings yellow with age. The story unfolded like pages from hell itself. The cabin had been built in 1923 directly over a Cherokee burial site, despite protests from the few remaining tribal members. The developer, a coal baron named Marcus Hartwell, had laughed off their warnings about disturbing the dead. The first tragedy came within months. Hartwell's own family had been found butchered in their beds, throats cut by person or persons unknown. The killer was never caught, though locals whispered about strange lights and voices in the mountains that night. During the coal wars of the 1930s, the cabin became a meeting place for union organizers, until a particularly brutal massacre left 7 men dead on the property. Their bodies were found arranged in a circle, each man's throat bearing identical ritual cuts. "Every few years, some fool thinks they can make money renting that place out," Betty continued, pulling out a manila folder thick with incident reports. "They never last long. Renters flee in the middle of the night, talking about voices in the walls, shadows that move wrong, and the feeling of being watched by things that ain't quite human. Most won't even talk about what they heard up there, but the ones that do all say the same thing. The cabin knows things about them it shouldn't, speaks their names like it's been waiting for them specifically." She fixed me with a stern look that chilled my blood. "You best pack up and leave today before it decides you belong to it permanent-like." I should have listened to Betty's warning and left immediately, but something kept me rooted to that cursed place. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or maybe the cabin had already begun to work its influence on me. I told myself I'd stay one more night to prove there was a rational explanation for everything. But deep down, I think I knew I was lying to myself. The mountain had claimed me the moment I'd heard my name whispered through those rotting walls. The second night began differently. As darkness crept across the hollers like spilled ink, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted so suddenly, I could see my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The old radiator sat cold and silent despite my attempts to coax heat from it, and even wrapped in every blanket I could find, my teeth chattered uncontrollably. But the cold was nothing compared to what came next. This time the voices didn't whisper. They conversed. Multiple entities speaking to each other about me as if I wasn't even there, discussing my life with the casual intimacy of old friends sharing gossip. They knew about my failed marriage, the miscarriage I'd never told anyone about, the pills I'd been taking to sleep at night. They spoke about my mother's death in clinical detail, describing how I'd held her hand as she'd slipped away, how I'd blamed myself for not being there sooner. "She's stronger than the others," one voice mused from somewhere behind the kitchen wall. "But she carries so much guilt. Guilt makes them easier to keep." Another voice, this one speaking from the ceiling beams, laughed with the sound of wind through dead leaves. "Look how she punishes herself. She'll stay willingly if we show her what she really deserves." The shadows began moving independently of any light source, stretching and contorting into shapes that suggested human forms pressed against the inside of the walls, trying to break through. I watched in horror as dark silhouettes danced across the floors and climbed the walls like living smoke. Their movements synchronized with the voices that continued their grotesque commentary on my existence. When I finally gathered enough courage to try to leave, I discovered the mountain's true trap. My car's engine turned over but died immediately, no matter how many times I tried. My phone showed no signal, not even emergency service. Worst of all, every path I took away from the cabin, whether following the dirt road or striking out through the woods, led me in a circle back to the front porch. The forest itself seemed to bend reality, creating an invisible maze that always deposited me exactly where I'd started, no matter which direction I walked or how carefully I marked my trail. I was trapped with whatever lived in those walls, and they were just getting started with me. The third night brought revelation and terror in equal measure. As midnight approached, the cabin's walls began to shimmer and fade, becoming translucent like dirty glass. What I saw beyond them defied every rational thought I'd ever held. Dozens of figures moved within the wood itself, Cherokee spirits with hollow eyes and mouths open in eternal screams. coal miners still bearing the wounds of their violent deaths, and the Hartwell family frozen in their final moments of agony. They weren't just trapped. They were part of the cabin now, their essence woven into every plank and beam. The Cherokee burial ground hadn't just been disturbed, it had been corrupted, turned into a prison that fed on suffering and guilt. Each new tragedy had only strengthened the bonds, adding more souls to its collection. But the most horrifying realization came when I saw myself among them, a ghostly figure already beginning to merge with the walls. The cabin hadn't chosen me randomly. It had called to the guilt I carried, the self-blame that had driven me to seek isolation in the first place. I understood then that every person who'd come here had been drawn by their own darkness, their own need for punishment. "You came here to disappear," the voices said in unison, no longer separate entities but a collective consciousness of the damned. "We're simply giving you what you wanted." The walls pressed closer, ready to claim another soul, but something in me finally fought back. I screamed my defiance into the darkness, refusing to let my guilt become their victory. The cabin shuddered around me like a living thing in pain. I woke to sunlight streaming across my face, lying in the dirt 50 yards from what remained of the cabin. The structure looked decades older than when I'd arrived. Roof caved in, walls rotted through, more ruin than shelter. My car started on the first try, my phone showed full signal. Everything seemed normal until I checked the date and realized I'd been missing for 3 weeks, not 3 days. The drive home passed in a blur of disbelief and relief, but the mountain wasn't finished with me. In quiet moments, during late-night showers, walking through empty parking garages, sitting alone in my apartment, I still hear them. Faint whispers carrying my name on impossible breezes, reminding me that some places never truly let you go. I escaped that night, but part of me remains trapped in those walls, and part of those walls followed me home. I'm recording this because I need you to understand what happened to me up there in the Appalachian Mountains. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about this world, and why I'll never hike alone again. 3 weeks ago, I was standing at the edge of the wilderness with my backpack loaded for what should have been a simple 3-day solo hike. I've done dozens of these trips before. The solitude, the challenge, the way the mountains strip away all the noise of modern life. But from the moment I stepped off that main trail, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet you expect in nature, but an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects, just the sound of my boots crunching on dead leaves and my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into something that was watching me. Waiting. I found the map tucked inside a used hiking guide I'd bought at a garage sale, hand-drawn on yellowed paper, showing a church marked deep in uncharted territory. When I asked the locals in Millfield about it, their faces went pale. They exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge they wouldn't voice. One old man just shook his head and muttered something about places that should stay lost. That should have been my warning. I left the marked trail at dawn, following that crude hand-drawn map deeper into territory no GPS had ever charted. The path, if you could call it that, was barely visible, just broken branches and disturbed earth that seemed to follow the contours sketched on that yellowed paper. Within an hour, the terrain turned hostile. Thorny undergrowth grabbed at my clothes like desperate fingers, tearing at my jacket and leaving scratches across my arms that burned in the mountain air. The ground beneath my feet became treacherous, forcing me to navigate around steep ravines that dropped into darkness so complete I couldn't see the bottom. The trees themselves seemed wrong, ancient oaks and pines that leaned inward over the path, their branches intertwining overhead like arthritic hands conspiring in whispered secrets. But it was the silence that truly unnerved me. With each step away from civilization, the natural sounds of the forest faded until even the wind seemed muted. No birds called from the canopy above. No squirrels chattered warnings of my presence. Even my own footsteps seemed swallowed by the oppressive quiet, as if the very air was thick with something that absorbed sound. That's when I started finding the markers. They were carved into trees along what I can only describe as a trail, though calling it that feels generous. Weathered symbols cut deep into bark that had grown around them over decades, maybe longer. Strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing on them completely. They were clearly old. The bark had healed around the edges, creating raised scar tissue that made the symbols appear to pulse in the dappled forest light. Each marker led me further from anything resembling civilization, deeper into mountains that felt increasingly alive and aware of my presence. I kept checking my compass, but the needle seemed sluggish, sometimes spinning in lazy circles before settling on directions that didn't match my map. As evening approached and the shadows began to lengthen between the trees, I stumbled into a clearing that made my blood run cold. Scattered across the open space were the remnants of old campsites, fire rings built from stones blackened by countless flames, their centers filled with ash that looked decades old. Personal belongings lay partially buried under years of fallen leaves. A rusted camping pot, the rotted remains of a sleeping bag, even what looked like children's toys. Their bright colors faded to ghostly pastels, but it was the singing that stopped me cold. Drifting through the mountains like smoke, a hymnal melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The harmony was perfect, hauntingly beautiful, and it made every hair on my body stand on end. I followed that haunting melody through a maze of limestone formations that jutted from the mountainside like broken teeth. The singing grew stronger with each step, pulling me forward through narrow passages between towering rocks that seemed to close in overhead. The sound echoed off the stone walls, creating layers of harmony that made my chest vibrate with each note. Then I saw it. The church emerged from the mountainside as if it had grown there naturally, its stone walls seamlessly integrated with the living rock. But this wasn't some crude frontier chapel. This was architecture that defied every law of physics I understood. The structure seemed to breathe, its walls expanding and contracting in my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at them, they appeared solid and still. It was pristine despite its obvious age. The stonework showed no signs of weathering, no moss or lichen growth that should have covered surfaces exposed to decades of mountain weather. Gothic spires twisted impossibly upward, disappearing into low-hanging clouds that seemed to swirl around them like living things. The entire building hummed with an energy that made my teeth ache. The stained glass windows were what truly stopped me cold. Even in the dying light of evening, they glowed with their own inner radiance, depicting scenes of worship and devotion. But as I watched, transfixed, the figures in the glass began to move. Painted congregants turned their heads to follow my movement. Angelic forms spread wings that hadn't been spread moments before. A minister at a pulpit raised his arms in blessing, his glass eyes meeting mine with an intelligence that should have been impossible. The singing was louder now, so close I could distinguish individual voices weaving together in perfect harmony. But when I pressed my face to the windows trying to see inside, the church appeared empty. Rows of wooden pews sat vacant in the soft glow of candles that flickered without wind. That's when I noticed the graves. They surrounded the church in neat rows, simple headstones emerging from the earth like accusations. Every single one bore the same death date, September 15, 1952. But it was the names that made my hands shake as I read them. They repeated in impossible patterns. Mary Elizabeth Thompson appeared on 7 different stones. James William Carter was carved into 9. The same names over and over, as if an entire community had died and been buried multiple times. My rational mind screamed at me to leave. Every instinct I'd developed over years of wilderness hiking told me this place was wrong, dangerous, something that shouldn't exist. But something else, something deeper and more primal, whispered that I needed to go inside. The singing called to me like a siren song, promising answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask. I reached for the heavy wooden door. The heavy door swung open with barely a touch, revealing an interior that took my breath away. The sanctuary was full, every pew occupied by what appeared to be a congregation in Sunday worship. Men in dark suits, women in modest dresses, children sitting perfectly still beside their parents. The singing I'd been hearing filled the space with rich, layered harmonies that seemed to emanate from the very walls. But something was terribly wrong. They were too still, too uniform in their posture. Every head was angled at exactly the same degree. Every hand was folded in identical fashion. When I tried to focus on individual faces, they seemed to flicker and shift like images from an old film reel struggling to maintain focus. The singing continued in perfect pitch, but not a single mouth moved. Not one chest rose and fell with breath. Near the entrance, an ornate guest book sat open on a wooden stand. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with entries spanning decades. My hands trembled as I read through them. Every entry was written in the same precise handwriting, the same black ink that should have faded years ago. But it was the signatures that made my blood freeze, page after page signed with my own name in my own handwriting, dating back to 1952. The altar drew my attention like a magnet. A leather-bound sermon book lay open, its pages seemingly untouched by time. The passage visible made my skin crawl. Blessed are the faithful who refuse to leave, for they shall find eternal communion in his house. Death is but a doorway to endless worship, and those who truly believe shall never pass through it. That's when I realized the truth that had been gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. The congregation wasn't ignoring me. They were acutely aware of my presence. As I stood frozen in the aisle, heads began to turn in my direction with mechanical precision. Row by row, starting from the front, they pivoted toward me in perfect synchronization. Faces that weren't quite faces. Eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. Smiles that stretched just a fraction too wide. The temperature plummeted so suddenly that my breath misted in front of my face. The candles flickered but didn't go out, their flames dancing to some unfelt breeze. Behind me I heard footsteps on the wooden floor, slow, deliberate steps approaching from the entrance I'd just walked through. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, nothing. The doorway stood empty, but the footsteps continued, growing closer with each passing second. The singing never stopped, never wavered, even as every head in the TRUE congregation turned to track my movement like flowers following the sun. I was trapped between the approaching, unseen presence and a congregation of the dead. I bolted from that sanctuary like my life depended on it, which I'm now certain it did. But the forest had become a maze designed to trap me. No matter which direction I ran, no matter how carefully I followed my own footprints back through the undergrowth, I always ended up at the same place, standing before those heavy wooden doors, chest heaving, sweat streaming down my face despite the mountain chill. On my fourth attempt to escape, desperation drove me to explore the church more thoroughly. That's when I found the basement entrance hidden behind the altar. A narrow stone staircase descending into darkness that felt older than the mountains themselves. What I discovered down there changed everything. Archive boxes filled with yellowed newspapers, church records, and photographs told a story that made my blood run cold. On September 15, 1952, during Sunday evening service, an unprecedented flash flood had torn through this valley. The congregation had been trapped inside as water rose faster than anyone could have imagined. Every single person in the church that night had drowned together, still in their pews, still singing hymns even as the water reached their necks. But their faith had been so absolute, their devotion so complete that death couldn't release them. They'd refused to move on, creating this pocket of existence outside normal reality where they could worship for eternity. The newspaper clippings showed search parties that never found the church, rescue workers who walked right past it as if it didn't exist. The final piece fell into place when I found a stack of identical hand-drawn maps, dozens of them, all showing the path I'd followed. They'd been planting them for decades, luring solitary hikers into their eternal congregation. They needed new voices, new souls to sustain their endless service. I tried to run again, but the landscape itself conspired against me. Trees moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, blocking paths that had been clear moments before. The ravines I'd crossed earlier had vanished, replaced by sheer cliff faces that hadn't existed on my way in. Even my compass spun wildly, its needle pointing toward the church no matter where I stood. That's when I heard the doors creak open behind me. They emerged in perfect formation. Men, women, children, all wearing the same beatific smiles. Their clothes were dry despite having drowned decades ago. Their skin had the translucent quality of things that had been underwater too long. As they walked toward me, their mouths opened in perfect unison, and that haunting hymn spilled forth once again. "Welcome, brother." Their voices harmonized as one. "We've been waiting so long for you to join our everlasting worship." The circle of worshipers closed around me, their cold hands reaching out in blessing, their dead eyes filled with a terrible, devoted love I escaped, barely, by destroying that guest book. As those cold hands reached for me and their voices called me to eternal worship, something deep inside me rebelled. I broke free from their circle and sprinted back into the church, tearing pages from that cursed registry, ripping apart decades of signatures written in my own hand. With each page destroyed, their hold on reality weakened. The church flickered like a dying light bulb, and suddenly I was running through normal forest again. I made it back to civilization, but I was changed. In quiet moments, I still hear that hymnal melody drifting through my thoughts. The church visits my dreams nightly, sometimes welcoming, sometimes accusing, always waiting. I know it's still out there, patient as stone, ready for the next solitary hiker who finds the right map. That's why I'm telling you this story. Appalachia hides dangers in its unexplored corners that our rational minds can't accept. Stay on marked trails. Don't trust hand-drawn maps. And if you hear singing where no one should be singing, run. But here's what terrifies me most. Lately, I've been having dreams about other places, other maps, other locations calling to me with the same irresistible pull. Sometimes I catch myself humming that hymnal tune without realizing it, just like I've been doing while recording this story. Maybe my escape wasn't as complete as I thought. I should have known better than to take that shortcut. The sun was already bleeding orange through the canopy of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I had maybe an hour of decent light left to get back to my cabin. What should have been a simple 3-mile hike had turned into something much longer, thanks to a washed-out bridge that forced me to find another route home. The forest around me had that late autumn feel, crisp air that bit at my lungs, leaves crunching beneath my boots with every step. I'd been hiking these mountains for years, knew them like the back of my hand, so when I spotted what looked like a game trail cutting through the dense undergrowth, I figured it was worth a shot. That's when everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the peaceful quiet you'd expect in the wilderness, but something deeper, more unsettling. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I paused, every instinct telling me something was wrong when I saw them. Lights, flickering between the trees about 50 yards ahead. At first I thought they might be other hikers with lanterns, maybe a camping group settling in for the night. But these lights were too uniform, too perfectly spaced. They hung in, the air like glowing orbs casting an amber glow that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. No response. Something deep in my gut screamed at me to turn around, to take the long way home, to get as far away from those lights as possible. But I couldn't look away. They were beautiful, in a haunting way, and I found myself taking a step forward, then another, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The moment I stepped toward those lights, they moved. Not dramatically, but just enough to stay tantalizingly out of reach. It was like they were aware of me, responding to my presence with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Each time I got close enough to make out their source, they would drift deeper into the forest, always maintaining that same hypnotic distance. I should have stopped, should have turned around right then and there. But something about those lights pulled at me with an almost magnetic force, and before I knew it, I was following them off the game trail entirely, pushing through thick underbrush and overfallen logs that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The forest around me began to change. The trees grew larger, more ancient, their trunks so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. Spanish moss hung like ghostly curtains from branches that blocked out what little daylight remained. This wasn't the managed wilderness I knew from the hiking trails. This was something primordial, untouched by human hands for generations. That's when I started noticing the markers. Carved into tree trunks at eye level were symbols I'd never seen before. Not Native American petroglyphs, nothing I recognized from my years of hiking and camping. These were crude, angular marks that looked almost like warnings. Some were barely visible, weathered by time and the elements, while others seemed more recent, their edges still sharp against the bark. The lanterns led me past the remnants of what had once been a road, just 2 parallel depressions in the earth now, overgrown with ferns and brambles. Rusted metal caught my eye, and I found the skeletal remains of mining equipment scattered throughout the area. A pickaxe handle, rotted beyond use, the twisted frame of what might have been a cart, even a section of narrow-gauge railroad track, consumed by decades of root growth and decay. This had been a mining operation, probably from the 1800s when these mountains were riddled with claims for coal and precious metals, but whatever had brought people to this remote valley, they'd abandoned it long ago, leaving only these rusted bones of industry to mark their passage. The lights continued their dance ahead of me, and I followed like a man possessed, until the forest suddenly opened into a clearing that took my breath away. Before me lay the ruins of an entire settlement. Rotting log cabins leaned against each other like drunken men, their roofs caved in and walls green with moss. At the center of it all stood the collapsed skeleton of what had once been a church, its steeple long since fallen and its windows nothing but empty black eyes staring into the gathering darkness. I was completely and utterly lost. The last traces of daylight vanished as I stood in that abandoned settlement, but the lanterns didn't dim. If anything, they seemed to grow brighter, their amber glow casting long, dancing shadows across the ruins. In their light, I could see details that the dying sun had hidden. Personal belongings scattered among the debris, furniture still arranged as if the inhabitants had simply stepped out for the evening and never returned. My phone had no signal, of course. The battery showed only 15%, and I realized I'd been walking for hours without any sense of direction. The smart thing would have been to find shelter and wait for morning. But something about this place made my skin crawl. I needed to understand what had happened here. The closest cabin still had most of its walls intact, so I carefully pushed open the warped wooden door. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound that seemed to echo unnaturally in the still air. Inside, dust particles danced in the lantern light streaming through gaps in the roof. A table sat in the center of the room, and on it, preserved by the dry mountain air, lay an old leather-bound journal. The pages crackled as I opened it, and I had to squint to make out the faded ink in the flickering light. The first entry was, dated October 15, 1847, written in the careful script of someone who'd learned to write by candlelight. "My name is Ezekiel Marsh," it began. "I fear this may be the last record of our settlement, and I pray that whoever finds this account will heed its warning." As I read on, my blood grew cold. Ezekiel wrote about the mountain folk, not other settlers, but something else entirely. He described how they would use lanterns to lure travelers deep into the woods, leading them in circles until they became hopelessly lost. People from the settlement had started disappearing, always after following strange lights they'd seen in the forest. They perform rituals, one entry read. Ancient practices that predate any Christian understanding. The lanterns are not mere tools. They are vessels for something hungry, something that feeds on the lost and forgotten. A whisper made me look up from the journal. It was so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the wind, but the air was perfectly still. Then I heard it again, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. Not words exactly, but something that sounded almost like voices having a conversation, just beyond the range of understanding. I stepped to the doorway and peered out into the settlement. The lanterns had multiplied. Where before there had been maybe a dozen lights scattered through the trees, now there were dozens surrounding the entire clearing in a perfect circle. They pulsed in unison like a heartbeat made of light. And between the ruins I caught glimpses of movement, dark shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk, always at the edge of my vision, always just beyond the reach of the lantern glow. Clutching Ezekiel's journal, I decided I'd seen enough. Whatever had happened to this settlement, I didn't want to share their fate. I picked what looked like the most direct route out of the clearing, heading toward where I thought the trail might be. But after walking for what felt like 20 minutes, I found myself standing at the edge of the same ruined church. I tried again, this time going in the complete opposite direction. The lanterns seemed to shift and move with me, always lighting a path that looked like it led away from the settlement. But no matter which direction I chose, no matter how carefully I tried to maintain a straight line, I always ended up back where I started. The lights had created some kind of maze, bending space itself around this cursed place. The whispers were getting louder now, and I realized they weren't coming from the shadows between the buildings. They were coming from the air itself, words in a language I didn't recognize mixed with sounds that might have been crying or screaming. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. Translucent figures moved between the ruins, their forms flickering like heat mirages. Men, women, even children, all dressed in clothing from different eras. Some wore the rough homespun of early settlers, others the more refined garments of later decades. They seemed to be trying to communicate with me, their mouths moving urgently, their ghostly hands pointing toward something beyond the settlement. One figure was clearer than the others, a tall man with a graying beard who matched the description Ezekiel had given of himself in the journal. He stood near the collapsed church, gesturing frantically toward a dark gap between two large boulders at the far edge of the clearing. As I approached, I could see the same strange symbols I'd found carved into the trees, but here they were etched deep into the stone itself. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it descended into absolute darkness. But the ghostly settlers were all pointing toward it, their expressions desperate, pleading. I clicked on my phone's flashlight, knowing I was burning precious battery life, and squeezed through the opening. The passage opened into a natural cave system, and my light revealed something that made my stomach drop. The walls were covered in paintings, not the ancient cave art you might expect, but more recent work done in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. They depicted figures dancing around fires, offering bound victims to something massive and tentacled that rose from the depths of the earth. And carved into the cave floor was a perfect circle filled with the same symbols I'd been seeing all night. This wasn't just a settlement that had been abandoned. This was a feeding ground. The lanterns weren't leading people astray for the sake of cruelty. They were gathering souls, collecting the lost and desperate to feed something ancient that slumbered deep within the mountain's heart. As I studied the blood-painted walls, the cave began to change around me. The air grew thick and oppressive, and I could feel something massive stirring in the depths below. The symbols on the floor started to glow with that same amber light as the lanterns, and then I heard it, a voice that seemed to come from the mountain itself. It didn't speak in words, but somehow I understood its hunger, its ancient patience, its satisfaction at having another lost soul delivered to its domain. The entity revealed itself not as a physical form, but as a presence so overwhelming that my knees buckled. This thing had been here since before the first humans set foot in these mountains, feeding on the lost and forgotten, growing stronger with each consumed soul. The settlers hadn't disappeared. They'd been devoured, their essence absorbed, and now they served as its hunting party, forced to lure others into the same trap that had claimed them. The ghostly figures I'd seen weren't trying to warn me away. They were trying to show me the only way to break the curse. Pulled out Ezekiel's journal with shaking hands and frantically flipped through the pages by my phone's dying light. There, in his final entry, was a crude drawing of the symbol circle with arrows indicating a specific sequence. He'd figured out how to reverse the ritual, but had run out of time before he could use it. Using my boot, I began pressing the symbols in the order Ezekiel had indicated, each one flashing brighter as I stepped on it. The mountain itself seemed to roar in protest, and suddenly the cave walls began to close in. Not gradually. They were actually moving, grinding together with a sound like breaking bones. I ran. The cave system became a nightmare maze of collapsing passages and plunging pits. My phone light flickered and died, leaving me to navigate by feel and instinct alone. Behind me, I could hear the mountain's fury, rocks tumbling and passages sealing themselves as if the entire structure was trying to trap me forever. Something grabbed at my ankle, a skeletal hand reaching up from a crevice, but I kicked free and kept running. The whispers had become screams now, the voices of all the souls this thing had consumed over the centuries, and they were getting louder, more desperate. Then I saw it, a thin line of gray light ahead. Dawn was breaking, and somehow I'd found my way back to the cave entrance. I squeezed through the gap between the boulders just as the opening collapsed behind me with a thunderous crash. The settlement was gone. In its place was just empty forest, and as the first rays of sunlight touched the trees, the lanterns flickered once and went dark forever. I stumbled out of the forest as the sun crested the mountains, my clothes torn and my hands bloodied from scrambling through the collapsing cave. When I finally found a road, I was 12 miles from where I'd started my hike, in a completely different valley. My cabin was a distant speck on the opposite ridge. The park rangers listened politely to my story, nodding with the practiced patience of people who'd heard similar tales from exhausted hikers before. Dehydration, they said, disorientation. The mind plays tricks in the wilderness. They suggested I see a doctor and maybe stick to marked trails in the future, but I couldn't let it go. Over the following weeks, I researched everything I could find about that area. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. Missing person reports going back to the 1960s, all following the same pattern. Experienced hikers who claimed to have seen strange lights in the forest, who ventured off established trails and were never seen again. The most recent was just 3 months before my own encounter. I drive past that stretch of forest sometimes, on my way to other hiking areas farther north. I tell myself I'm just taking the scenic route, but the truth is I can't help looking. And last week, as twilight settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains, I swear I saw it again. A single amber light flickering between the trees, patient and persistent, waiting for the next lost soul to follow its deadly beacon deeper into the Appalachian wilderness. I'm writing this from my hospital bed, hands still shaking as I try to forget what I unearthed 3 days ago. The doctors say it's shock, but they don't know about the ridge, about Granddaddy's warnings, or about what's been buried in these Appalachian hills for generations. The smell of damp earth still clings to my clothes, and every time I close my eyes, I see those hollow sockets staring back at me from the dirt. 3 days. That's all it took to destroy everything I thought I knew about my family, about our land, about the very ground I grew up walking on. The nurses keep asking if I have someone to call, someone who can come sit with me, but how do you explain to people that everyone who could have warned me is dead? How do you tell them that the reason I'm here, bandaged and sedated, isn't because of some accident or attack, but because I was stupid enough to ignore the one rule that kept our family safe for over 2 centuries? My grandfather used to say the mountains have long memories, longer than any living soul, longer than the oldest stories passed down through generations of hill folk who knew better than to ask too many questions about certain places. But I was educated, modern, rational. I thought his warnings were just the ramblings of an old mountain man who'd spent too many years listening to wind howl through the hollows. I should have listened. When Granddaddy passed last October, I inherited 300 acres of remote Appalachian wilderness that I hadn't seen since childhood. Growing up in Atlanta had softened my mountain roots, turned me into one of those city folks the locals whispered about with barely concealed disdain. I drove up that winding dirt road with my real estate appraiser, planning to survey the land and put it on the market within the month. Easy money, I thought. Prime development property just 2 hours from civilization. The first thing that struck me wasn't the breathtaking view of rolling hills stretching toward the horizon, or the way morning mist clung to the valleys like ghostly fingers. It was the trees, dozens of them, scarred with deep carvings that looked fresh despite being weathered gray by years of mountain storms. Stay away from the ridge carved into the bark of an ancient oak. Do not dig slashed across a maple near the property line. What's buried stays buried, etched so deep into a pine tree that sap still wept from the wounds. The appraiser, a nervous man named Henderson, who kept checking his phone for signal that would never come, suggested we stick to the lower elevations. Mountain folk have their ways, he muttered, avoiding my eyes. Best not to stir up old grievances. I laughed it off. Superstitious nonsense from people who probably still believed in fairy rings and haunted hollers. But as we walked the perimeter, I found more warnings carved into fence posts, painted on rocks, even spelled out in river stones arranged along the creek bed, all pointing toward the same forbidden zone, the eastern ridge that rose like a sleeping giant above the tree line. That night in town, trying to grab dinner at the only diner within 30 miles, I asked the waitress about the property. Her coffee-stained smile disappeared instantly. She glanced around the near-empty restaurant before leaning close, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Your granddaddy was a good man, kept his word for 70 years. She straightened up, suddenly busy wiping down tables that were already clean. Best you do the same. The locals treated me like I carried some contagious disease. Conversation stopped when I entered stores. Eyes followed me down empty streets with a mixture of pity and fear that made my skin crawl. Even the gas station attendant refused my money, just pumped my tank and waved me away like I was already dead. I started remembering things then. Childhood visits to Granddaddy's cabin, how he'd wake me before dawn every full moon to walk the property lines with a leather satchel full of salt and strange herbs. Keeping the covenant, he'd mutter, sprinkling his concoction along invisible boundaries while speaking words in a language that definitely wasn't English. Promise me something, boy, he'd said during my last visit, gripping my shoulders with hands that felt like tree bark. Whatever happens to this old mountain, whatever you hear about treasure or fortune buried in these hills, you remember this. Some things are meant to stay buried. The ridge keeps its secrets for good reason. But standing there in my expensive suit, calculator in hand, all I could see was dollar signs. 2 months later, when the medical bills started piling up and my consulting business collapsed, Desperation became my closest companion. My wife's cancer treatments were bleeding us dry, and that pristine mountain property suddenly looked like salvation, wrapped in 300 acres of untapped potential. But it was the stories that really hooked me. Whispered tales in the diner about Confederate gold buried somewhere on our family land. About my great-great-grandfather who supposedly hid a fortune before disappearing into the wilderness during the Civil War. I told myself I was being practical. One small excavation near the ridge just to see if the legends held any truth. I rented equipment from a company 3 counties over, claiming I needed to install a septic system. The lies came easier than I expected. The moment my shovel bit into the earth near the eastern ridge, something changed. The forest, which had been alive with birdsong and rustling leaves, fell into an unnatural silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. Even the wind stopped moving through the trees, leaving the air thick and oppressive. My first tool broke within an hour. The handle of a brand new shovel snapped clean in half, the wood splintering like it had been struck by lightning. I blamed poor craftsmanship and grabbed the backup. That one lasted 20 minutes before the metal blade twisted into an impossible shape, as if the earth itself had reached up and crushed it. But I kept digging. Something drove me forward, a compulsion that felt stronger than logic or fear. Every muscle in my body screamed to stop, to walk away, to respect the boundaries my grandfather had died protecting. Instead, I found myself working through the night, guided only by moonlight and a hunger I couldn't name. That's when I noticed the symbols. As I cleared away centuries of accumulated soil and debris, carved stone surfaces emerged from the darkness. Intricate patterns spiraled across granite faces, symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes weren't meant to process their geometry. They seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, dancing just beyond comprehension. The animals fled first. Squirrels abandoned their trees, deer bounded away without looking back, and even the insects disappeared, leaving behind a dead zone of absolute quiet. I should have recognized the warning, should have understood that when nature itself rejects a place, humans have no business disturbing it. But then I saw the glint of metal buried deep in the black soil. My heart hammered against my ribs as I brushed dirt away from what looked like the corner of an ornate chest or box. This was it. This was the treasure that would save my family, pay our debts, give us the fresh start we desperately needed. The air grew colder with each shovelful I removed. My breath began to fog despite the warm autumn night, and somewhere in the distance I swear I heard something that sounded almost like weeping, but the metal grew larger, more defined, and greed made me deaf to every warning the mountain was screaming. What I unearthed wasn't treasure. It was horror beyond anything my civilized mind could process. The metallic glint that had driven me to dig through the night belonged to rusted chains wrapped around human remains. Not one body, but dozens arranged in concentric circles like some grotesque mandala of death. Their bones were stained black with age, but somehow perfectly preserved, as if the earth itself had been reluctant to claim them. The stench hit me first. Not the clean smell of ancient bones, but something putrid and alive like decay that refused to finish its work. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing across eye sockets that seemed to track my movement even in death. Some skulls showed signs of violent trauma. Others bore evidence of ritualistic modification, holes drilled in precise patterns, symbols carved directly into bone. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs as frost began forming on the exposed remains, glittering like diamonds in my flashlight beam. Somewhere in the darkness beyond my excavation, I heard whispers, not words I could understand, but sounds that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to some primal part of my brain, triggering every evolutionary warning my species had developed over millennia of survival. These weren't just random burials. The bodies were positioned with deliberate care, arms interlocked, faces turned inward toward something at the center of the circle. As I cleared more soil, artifacts emerged that made my blood run cold. Native American pottery sat alongside European crosses, Celtic knots intertwined with symbols I didn't recognize, all arranged around what looked like a stone altar stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Languages that predated English, maybe predated human speech entirely. I could feel eyes watching me from every shadow, from every hollow socket in the pit below. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe, heavy with malevolent intention. That's when I understood. This wasn't a burial ground. It was a prison. Every body in that circle had been placed there for a purpose. Every artifact positioned to contain something that must never be allowed to escape. The chains weren't decorative. They were functional. The symbols weren't religious. They were protective wards. And I, in my arrogant ignorance, had just broken a seal that had held for centuries. The earth beneath my feet began to vibrate, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from somewhere far below the bodies I'd uncovered. Dirt and small stones started falling back into the pit, as if the mountain itself was trying to cover up what I'd exposed. But it was too late. Whatever had been sleeping in that cursed ground was waking up, and every bone in my body knew that I had just unleashed something that would have been better left buried, until the end of time. The real horror wasn't what I'd found, it was what I'd freed. The attack started before I could even climb out of the pit. Invisible hands grabbed at my ankles, trying to drag me back down among the bones. I clawed at the dirt walls, my fingernails breaking as something with the strength of 10 men pulled me deeper into that cursed ground. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices speaking in tongues that made my ears bleed just to hear them. I broke free and ran. Sprinted through the forest toward my truck, branches whipping across my face as shadows moved between the trees with impossible speed. But when I reached the spot where I'd parked, there was nothing. Just empty ground and tire tracks that led nowhere, as if my vehicle had simply vanished into the mountain air. The road was gone too. The path I'd driven up that morning had disappeared, replaced by dense undergrowth that looked like it had been growing undisturbed for decades. I was trapped, and something in those woods was hunting me. I stumbled back to Granddaddy's cabin as dawn broke over the ridge, only to find the front door standing wide open. Inside, furniture was overturned, windows shattered, and claw marks gouged deep into the wooden walls. But in the chaos, I discovered something that changed everything. A hidden compartment beneath the floorboards containing leather-bound journals dating back to 1847. The truth was worse than any supernatural horror I could have imagined. My family weren't just mountain folk who'd inherited prime real estate. We were guardians, bound by blood and ancient oaths to keep imprisoned an entity that had terrorized these hills for centuries before European settlers ever set foot on the continent. Native tribes had sealed it first. Then my ancestors had taken over the duty when the original guardians were slaughtered by disease and warfare. Generation after generation, we'd maintained the barriers. Monthly rituals, protective wards, and absolute adherence to one simple rule: never disturb the eastern ridge. The burial site wasn't where the entity was trapped. It was where its previous guardians had sacrificed themselves to strengthen the prison when containment began to fail. Granddaddy's final entry was dated just days before his death. The boy doesn't understand his inheritance. If something happens to me before I can teach him properly, God help us all. As I read those words, something slammed into the cabin wall hard enough to shake the entire structure. Then another impact and another, like enormous fists pounding against wood and stone. Through the broken windows, I could see shapes moving in the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something hungry and ancient that had been waiting over a century for freedom. The journals contained instructions for the protective rituals, but they required supplies I didn't have and knowledge I'd never learned. I could try to flee again, abandoning my hereditary duty and leaving this evil to spread beyond the mountain. Or I could stay and face something that had driven my ancestors to sacrifice everything, including their lives, to keep contained. The pounding stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard my grandfather's voice whisper from the shadows. "Choose wisely, boy. Some burdens can't be abandoned." Somehow, buried deep in childhood memories, I remembered the words. Granddaddy's voice guiding me through those moonlit walks, teaching me phrases in that ancient language while I thought we were just playing games. My hands shook as I gathered salt and herbs from his hidden stores, following rituals that felt both foreign and familiar, like muscle memory awakening after decades of sleep. The entity fought me every step. Shadows clawed at my face as I walked the property lines. Invisible forces knocked the sacred items from my hands, and voices screamed promises of wealth and power if I'd just stop, just let it go free. But I pressed on, speaking words that burned my throat, completing circles that my grandfather and his grandfather before him had walked for over a century. At dawn, the forest fell silent again. The barriers held, but barely. I could feel them straining, weakened by my interference, cracked by the breach I'd created in my ignorance. The entity was contained, but not defeated, and now I understood the weight my family had carried all these years. The medical bills that drove me to this mountain seem insignificant now, compared to the responsibility I've inherited. I am the guardian now, bound to this cursed ridge until my own grandson grows old enough to take my place. Every month I'll walk these boundaries, speak these words, maintain these seals. Every day I'll carry the knowledge that one mistake, one moment of weakness, could unleash something that makes my worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. They've discharged me from the hospital, but I'm not going home to Atlanta. This mountain is my home now, my prison and my purpose. The nurses think I'm suffering from trauma-induced delusion, but the locals know better. I see it in their eyes when they look at me now. The same mixture of respect and pity they showed my grandfather. So let this be a warning to anyone who thinks old mountain wisdom is just superstition. Some family legacies aren't inheritance. They're curses disguised as land. And sometimes the only treasure worth finding is the terrible knowledge of what should stay buried forever. The ridge keeps its secrets, and now I keep the ridge. I've been hiking these Appalachian Mountains for 15 years, and I thought I knew every ridge, every hidden valley, every game trail that snakes through the ancient forests. But that October morning, following what I assumed was a deer path deeper into the wilderness than I'd ever ventured, I discovered something that shouldn't exist, something that made my blood run cold the moment I laid eyes on it. The trees opened suddenly into a perfect clearing, as if nature itself had stepped back in reverence or fear. There, arranged in a flawless circle maybe 30 feet across, stood 7 massive stones. These weren't the rough field stones you'd find scattered throughout these mountains. These were monoliths, each one standing nearly 8 feet tall and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They were so old they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Yet the markings remained deep and clear. But it was stepping closer that really unsettled me. The air inside that circle felt different, heavier somehow, as if it carried the weight of untold ages. My ears popped like I was ascending to high altitude even though I was standing in a valley. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees the moment I crossed an invisible threshold about 6 feet from the stones. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around and walk away, but curiosity has always been my weakness. That's when I noticed the symbols weren't staying still. From the corner of my eye I could swear they were shifting, rearranging themselves into new patterns when I wasn't looking directly at them. The carvings seemed to writhe and pulse with their own rhythm, like ancient words trying to reform themselves into something I might understand. I stood there transfixed, feeling like an intruder in a place that predated human memory, where something far older than the mountains themselves had once walked. I should have listened to that primal voice telling me to leave, but instead I found myself taking one step forward, then another, until I crossed the invisible boundary into the circle itself. The moment my boot touched the ground inside those ancient stones, reality seemed to hiccup around me. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made my head spin. I watched my shadow fall across the center of the circle. Then suddenly the sun was in a completely different position overhead, casting my shadow in the opposite direction. Had minutes passed or hours? My watch had stopped at exactly 3:17, though I couldn't remember what time I'd entered the clearing. The digital display flickered between numbers that didn't make sense. 2784, 1399, impossible times that shouldn't exist. The shadows cast by the monoliths began moving independently of the sun's position, stretching and writhing like living things reaching for something just beyond their grasp. They seemed to be trying to form shapes, human figures perhaps, or something that had once been human. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from altitude sickness or dehydration, but the shadows continued their impossible dance. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, like wind through dry leaves, but gradually becoming more distinct. They spoke in a language I'd never heard before. Not Cherokee, not any native tongue I recognized from my archaeological studies. The words were older than that, more guttural, as if they were being spoken by throats not quite designed for human speech. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, the stones themselves, the ground beneath my feet, the very air around me. I spun in a slow circle, trying to locate the source, and that's when I saw them. Figures moving between the stones, translucent and wavering like heat mirages, but undeniably there. They wore clothing from different eras, rough homespun that could have been colonial, buckskins that suggested frontier times, even what looked like more modern hiking gear. All of them moved with the same purpose, walking slowly toward the center of the circle where I stood frozen in terror. Their faces were the worst part. When I managed to catch a glimpse before they faded back into the shifting shadows, their expressions were identical. Mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with an agony that had lasted far too long. They reached toward me with desperate hands as if I could somehow pull them free from whatever held them in this place. That's when my nerve finally broke. I ran, crashing through the underbrush like a panicked animal, not caring about the thorns tearing at my clothes or the branches whipping across my face. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, and even then my hands shook so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. But during the long drive home through the winding mountain roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that circle. Sleep that night was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reaching figures and heard whispers in that ancient language echoing through my mind. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed answers, if only to prove my own sanity. I spent the next 3 days buried in the university library's archives, digging through historical records, geological surveys, and ethnographic studies of the region. What I found made my blood run cold all over again. The stone circle appeared in documents dating back to the earliest European settlements, always described in hushed, fearful terms. A 1763 journal entry from a surveyor named Thomas Whitmore mentioned a ring of devil stones where the very air grows thick with malice, and no Cherokee will venture near. Colonial ministers wrote of heathen rituals conducted at the site, though they admitted never witnessing these ceremonies themselves, only finding the aftermath. The Cherokee oral histories were even more disturbing. According to tribal elders interviewed in the early 1900s, the stone circle predated their own arrival in the mountains by centuries. They called it the place where the hungry shadow sleeps, and their legends spoke of an entity that existed before the world took its current form, something that had been bound there by ancient peoples whose names were lost to time. The Cherokee avoided the area entirely, believing that whoever built those stones had sacrificed themselves to keep something terrible contained. The entity's presence followed me home like an infection spreading through my life. What started as unsettling dreams quickly escalated into waking manifestations that made me question my grip on reality. Shadows in my apartment began moving independently, sliding across walls in patterns that reminded me of the symbols on those ancient stones. I'd catch glimpses of dark shapes in my peripheral vision, always just beyond direct sight, but when I turned to look, nothing was there except the lingering sensation of being watched by something ancient and patient. The temperature drops came next. I'd be sitting at my desk researching, and suddenly my breath would fog in the air as the room plunged 20 degrees in seconds. My landlord insisted the heating system was working perfectly, but I found myself wearing winter coats indoors, watching frost form on the inside of my windows even though it was still October outside. But the voices were the worst part. That same guttural language I'd heard in the circle began echoing through my apartment at all hours, sometimes so faint I thought it might be the wind, other times loud enough to wake me from deep sleep. The words seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if something was moving through the spaces between rooms, calling out in increasingly desperate tones. Then my belongings started rearranging themselves. I'd come home to find my books stacked in perfect circles on the living room floor, or discover that every piece of furniture had been pushed into a ring around the coffee table. Kitchen utensils arranged themselves in spiral patterns on the counters, and my clothes appeared folded in concentric circles inside my dresser drawers. Each time I'd frantically put everything back where it belonged. But by morning, the circular arrangements would return. My research had become an obsession, driving me deeper into archives and databases, following every lead about the stone circle's origins. What I discovered in a crumbling manuscript at the Smithsonian made my hands shake as I read. The document, supposedly translated from tablets found at an archaeological dig in Turkey, described an entity called the Bound One, something that existed before human civilization, a consciousness of pure hunger that fed on reality itself. According to the text, ancient peoples had recognized this entity as an existential threat to the world. They'd built containment sites across the globe, stone circles designed not just to imprison, but to gradually drain the entity's power over centuries. The builders had knowingly sacrificed their own life forces to power these prisons, binding their souls to the stones to maintain the containment even after death. But the manuscript's final passage filled me with dread. The binding was never meant to be permanent. It was designed to weaken over time, requiring periodic renewal by new sacrifices. Without fresh life force to maintain the prison, the containment would eventually fail, releasing something that should never have existed back into a world unprepared for its hunger. The whispers in my apartment grew louder that night, and for the first time I understood some of the words. Come home. I fought against the compulsion for 3 days, but it was like trying to resist gravity itself. The pull grew stronger with each passing hour, a magnetic force that seemed to tug at something deep in my chest, drawing me inexorably back toward those mountains. By the 4th morning, I found myself driving the winding roads without any conscious decision to do so, my hands steering the wheel while my mind screamed protests that went unheard. The forest had changed. Trees that should have been turning autumn colors stood bare and lifeless, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The usual sounds of wildlife had been replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my eardrums. Even the wind had died, leaving the air still and heavy with anticipation. When I reached the clearing, I barely recognized it. The stone circle now pulsed with an inner light, each symbol carved into the monoliths glowing with sickly phosphorescence that hurt to look at directly. The grass inside the ring had died completely, leaving only bare earth arranged in a perfect spiral pattern that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't focusing on it directly. The entity's presence was overwhelming now, no longer hiding behind whispers and shadows. It spoke directly into my mind with a voice like grinding stone, offering visions that made my knees weak. I saw myself wielding knowledge that would revolutionize human understanding, unlocking secrets that had been hidden since the dawn of time. I could become more than human, it promised, elevated beyond the mundane limitations of mortal existence. All it required was a simple gesture. One of the binding stones had developed a hairline crack running from base to tip. Centuries of containment had finally taken their toll. A single strike with the sledgehammer that had mysteriously appeared beside the circle would be enough to shatter the weakened monolith and break the ancient prison. The hammer felt impossibly heavy in my hands as I approached the cracked stone, the entity's promises growing more seductive with each step. Power beyond imagination, knowledge that would make me godlike among mortals, the secrets of existence itself, all waiting just beyond that thin barrier of carved granite. The symbols on the stones blazed brighter, and I could feel the entity's hunger pressing against the weakening bonds. Desperate for release after millennia of imprisonment, I raised the hammer above my head, feeling the weight of destiny in my trembling arms while somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered warnings I was no longer certain I wanted to hear. The hammer trembled in my raised hands as 2 voices warred in my mind, the entity's seductive promises and the desperate warnings of those ancient builders who had sacrificed everything to keep this thing contained. I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me, the accumulated suffering of everyone who had vanished in this place, their souls still trapped in service to a prison that was finally failing. The cracked stone pulsed with otherworldly light, so close to breaking that I could almost see through to whatever writhed beyond. The entity's hunger was palpable now, pressing against my thoughts like a physical force, showing me visions of power and knowledge that no human had ever possessed. But I also saw the faces of those translucent figures, still reaching toward me with silent screams of warning. Their sacrifice had bought the world time, and now that choice had fallen to me. What happened next? That's where my story ends and your imagination begins. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. I'm telling you this story because the shadows I encountered underground in Black Ridge, West Virginia, didn't stay buried. They followed me home. And I need people to understand what's lurking beneath Appalachia's mountains before someone else makes the same mistake I did. I lasted exactly 7 days in that dying coal mining town. 7 days was all it took for everything I thought I knew about reality to crumble like the rotting support beams in those cursed tunnels. Black Ridge looked like a place time had forgotten and God had abandoned. I'd driven 3 hours through winding mountain roads to get there, hired as a geological surveyor for Titan Mining Corporation's ambitious plan to reopen the abandoned shafts that had once made this town prosperous. The job paid twice what I'd make anywhere else, which should have been my first warning. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I felt it, an oppressive weight in the air that made breathing feel like work. Half the building stood empty, their windows boarded with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bone. Paint peeled from storefronts like diseased skin. The few locals I encountered spoke in hushed whispers, their eyes darting nervously toward the mountains that loomed over the town like sleeping giants. Main Street was a graveyard of American dreams. Empty lots where buildings had been torn down sat like missing teeth in a skull's grin. The few businesses still operating, a diner, a gas station, a hardware store, felt more like museums preserving the memory of better times than actual places of commerce. But it was the way people looked at me that truly unsettled me. When I mentioned I was there to survey the old mines, conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes widened with something between pity and terror. More than once I caught elderly residents crossing themselves when they thought I wasn't looking. I should have left that first day. The warning signs were everywhere, written in the hollow stares of people who'd seen too much and the unnatural silence that hung over everything like a funeral shroud. But I needed the money, and I'd always prided myself on being rational, scientific. I thought their superstitions were just small-town folklore. I was wrong about everything. Frank Henley met me at the Mercy Mine entrance on my second morning in Black Ridge. He was everything you'd expect from a man who'd spent 40 years underground. Weathered skin like old leather, hands permanently stained with coal dust, and eyes that had seen things they'd rather forget. When he shook my hand, his grip felt like sandpaper against stone. "You sure about this, son?" he asked, adjusting the hard hat on his graying head. "Ain't too late to find yourself different work." I laughed it off, checking my equipment one final time. "Just some geological surveys, Frank. Nothing I haven't done 100 times before." He didn't laugh back. Instead, he stared at the mine entrance, a black mouth carved into the mountainside, surrounded by rusted metal framework that looked like broken ribs. "This ain't like other places you've worked. Mercy Mine's got a memory, and it ain't a good one." The elevator cage that lowered us into the earth groaned and shuddered with each foot of descent. 300 feet down, then 400, then 5. The natural light faded above us until only our headlamps cut through the absolute darkness that pressed against us like a living thing. The moment we stepped off the elevator, I knew Frank was right. This wasn't like anywhere I'd worked before. The air itself felt wrong, thick and metallic, tasting of rust and decay. Every breath was an effort, as if the atmosphere was fighting against my lungs. Our headlamps, powerful LED units that should have illuminated the tunnel for 50 feet in any direction, seemed strangely muted. The darkness absorbed our light, swallowing it before it could reveal more than a few yards ahead. "Stay close," Frank muttered, his voice echoing strangely in the tunnel. "And whatever you do, don't wander off into the dead zones." "Dead zones?" He gestured toward branching passages that disappeared into absolute blackness, places where the boys refused to work, where the shadows seemed thicker than they ought to be. Company's been trying to get crews down there for months, but nobody lasts more than an hour before they come running back up, pale as ghosts and twice as scared. We walked deeper into the main tunnel, our boots crunching on loose gravel and coal fragments. The support beams overhead creaked ominously with each step, wooden timbers that had been holding back tons of rock and earth for decades. Some were cracked, others bowed under the immense pressure, but they all seemed to whisper warnings in the language of stressed wood and shifting stone. That's when I saw the equipment. Mining carts sat perfectly positioned along the tracks, still loaded with coal that gleamed black in our lamplight. Pickaxes and shovels lay scattered across the tunnel floor, not rusted or deteriorated despite decades of abandonment, but looking as if they'd been dropped moments ago. Lunch pails sat open on makeshift tables, their contents long since consumed by time, but their placement suggesting meals interrupted mid-bite. "It's like they just vanished," I whispered, running my hand along a pristine mining cart. Frank's face went pale in the artificial light. September 15th, 1987. 17 men working the day shift. When the evening crew came down, they found everything just like you see it now. Tools laid out, work half finished, but not a soul in sight. The whispers started then, so faint I almost convinced myself they were just echoes of our own voices bouncing off distant tunnel walls. But as we stood there in that graveyard of abandoned industry, The sounds grew clearer, voices speaking in harmonious cadences that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth. The language was unlike anything I'd ever heard, syllables that felt ancient and primal, words that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something deeper in my brain. Frank grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my jacket with desperate strength. "We need to go, now." But I was already listening to those voices, and part of me never wanted to stop. That evening, I couldn't get those whispers out of my head. They echoed in my motel room, seeming to seep through the thin walls like smoke. Sleep was impossible, so I did what any rational person would do. I started digging for answers. The Black Ridge Public Library was a cramped building that smelled of mildew and forgotten dreams. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Patterson, watched me with suspicious eyes as I requested everything they had on Mercy Mine. Her arthritic hands trembled as she pulled out boxes of newspaper clippings, mining company records, and incident reports that painted a picture far darker than anything Titan Mining had shared with me. September 15th, 1987. The headline in the Black Ridge Gazette screamed the truth. 17 miners vanish without trace. The article described a mystery that had stumped investigators for months. The day shift had clocked in normally at 6 a.m. By 6 p.m., when the evening crew arrived, the mine was empty. No signs of struggle, no indication of cave-in or accident. Just 17 men who had simply vanished into the earth. But that was only the beginning of Mercy Mine's dark history. I spent hours poring over decades of incident reports, cave-ins that killed 12 men in 1963, a gas explosion in 1971 that claimed 8 lives, and scattered throughout the records like breadcrumbs leading to something unspeakable, were reports that made my blood run cold. Miners describing shadow people moving through the tunnels. Workers refusing to enter certain sections because the darkness there watched them back. Supervisors documenting equipment failures in specific areas, where the temperature would drop 20 degrees without explanation. One report from 1984 described a miner named Joe Crawford who emerged from the deep tunnels speaking in what he called the old language under his syllables. That matched perfectly with the whispers I'd heard. The most disturbing discovery came buried in the original surveying documents from 1952. The mining company had built Mercy Mine directly over what local Cherokee records identified as a sacred burial ground, not just any burial ground, but a place where their ancestors had sealed away something they called the hungry dark. I knew I needed to talk to someone who'd lived through it all. Martha Henley ran the town's only diner, a grease-stained establishment that served as Black Ridge's unofficial information hub. She was Frank's wife, though I didn't know it at the time. When I mentioned the missing miners, her coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "You're talking about my Jimmy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband was one of those 17 men." Martha's hands shook as she poured me another cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "They didn't just disappear, you understand? They were taken by something that's been sleeping under this mountain since before white men ever set foot in these hills." She leaned across the worn formica table, her eyes wide with a fear that 35 years hadn't diminished. The Cherokee knew. They tried to warn the mining company when they started digging, but nobody listened. Said there were things down there that should never see daylight again, things that fed on human souls and grew stronger with each life they claimed. "Martha, that's just superstition?" She laughed bitterly. "I thought the same thing until the night Jimmy disappeared. That evening I felt something pass through our house like a cold wind, something that smelled of deep earth and ancient hunger, and I knew, without anyone having to tell me, that my husband wasn't coming home." She reached across the table and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Whatever Titan Mining is paying you, it ain't worth your life. Those things down there have been patient for decades, but they're waking up again, and they're hungry." Her words followed me back to my motel room, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, and the whispers in the walls grew louder with each passing hour. My second week underground, Frank called in sick. Food poisoning, he claimed. But I could hear the fear in his voice when he told me I'd have to survey the eastern shaft alone, the same shaft he'd warned me about on day one of those dead zones where shadows seemed thicker than they should be. I should have refused. Should have told Titan Mining I wasn't comfortable working solo in unexplored sections, but the company was breathing down my neck about timeline delays, and my pride wouldn't let me admit that an abandoned coal mine was making me nervous. The eastern shaft branched off from the main tunnel like a crooked finger pointing deeper into the mountain's heart. The moment I crossed that threshold, my equipment began acting up. My digital thermometer flickered between readings, 58 degrees, then 34, then an impossible -12 that made no sense at our depth. The electromagnetic sensor I used to detect metal ore started screaming alerts, its needle spinning wildly as if it had found the world's largest iron deposit directly beneath my feet. Then my headlamp began to dim. Not the gradual fade of a dying battery, but a sudden dramatic loss of illumination that left me standing in near total darkness. I tapped the side of the lamp, checking connections, but the LED remained stubbornly weak. It was as if something was actively draining the light, pulling illumination from my equipment and feeding on it. That's when I saw them, shadows moving along the tunnel walls, but not shadows cast by anything in the physical world. They flowed like liquid darkness independent of my weakened headlamp, sliding across stone surfaces with purpose and intelligence. They moved toward me with predatory grace, and as they approached, the temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath misted in the frigid air. "David," they whispered, and hearing my name spoken by voices that seemed to come from the rock itself made every hair on my body stand on end. "David, we've been waiting for you." I backed against the tunnel wall, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Hallucinations brought on by poor air quality, hypothermia affecting my perception, anything except what I was actually seeing. Shadows that moved with intention, darkness that knew my name. The entities began showing me visions then, images that burned themselves into my retinas with crystalline clarity. I saw the 17 missing miners, but they weren't dead. They stood in a vast underground chamber I'd never seen on any company survey, their faces pale as grave marble, their eyes black as the coal they'd once mined. They wore the same clothes they'd disappeared in 35 years ago, but their bodies had changed. They moved with fluid, inhuman grace, and when they opened their mouths, that ancient language poured forth in harmonious chorus. They weren't victims. They were converts. "Join us, David," the miners called in unison, their voices echoing from impossible directions. "Join us in the eternal dark. We have such wonders to show you, such truths to reveal. The company thinks they can control what sleeps beneath, but they've only awakened something that has waited centuries for new souls to claim." I understood then with horrible clarity. Titan Mining's attempts to reopen the shafts had disturbed something far older than Cherokee burial grounds. Their drilling and blasting had awakened entities that existed in the spaces between light and dark, beings that fed on human consciousness and grew stronger with each soul they claimed. The shadows pressed closer, and I felt their cold touch against my skin like fingers made of winter night. They wanted me to stay, to join their subterranean congregation, to add my voice to their eternal chorus. I ran then, my weakened headlamp barely illuminating the path back to the main tunnel. Behind me, laughter echoed through the passages, not human laughter, but something that had learned to mimic joy while forgetting what it truly meant. They followed me to the surface that day, and they've been following me ever since. That night, the shadows followed me home. I first noticed them in my motel room mirror, dark shapes moving behind my reflection that shouldn't have been there. When I spun around, the room was empty, but the mirror showed writhing darkness where my image should have been. I covered every reflective surface with towels, but it didn't matter. They were already inside. The temperature in my room dropped 20 degrees without warning. The cheap motel heater rattled and died. My breath misted as I watched shadows seep under the door like black water, pooling on the stained carpet before rising into humanoid shapes that beckoned me with gestures of false welcome. "David," they whispered from every corner simultaneously. "Why do you resist? We offer eternal purpose, communion with something greater than your small human existence. Join us willingly, and the transition will be painless." I pressed myself against the far wall, grabbing the room's Bible from the nightstand drawer. The shadows recoiled slightly when I held it up, but their laughter filled the air like rustling leaves. "Your human gods have no power here," they hissed. "We are older than your Christ, older than your prayers. We were here when the Cherokee sealed us away, and we'll be here when the last human soul joins our congregation." Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw visions of that underground chamber, filled with dozens of converted souls spanning decades of disappearances. The 17 miners from 1987 were just the most recent addition to something that had been growing since the mine first opened. By morning, I realized the entire town was complicit. The way people avoided eye contact suddenly made sense. They weren't just superstitious. They were survivors of a decades-long siege. Over breakfast at Martha's Diner, I overheard conversations that chilled my blood. Lost the Peterson boy last week, an old man muttered into his coffee. Found his truck by the mine entrance, but no sign of him. Third one this year, Martha replied, refilling cups with shaking hands. They're getting hungrier. I confronted Frank that afternoon, cornering him outside the mine office. His face crumbled when I described what I'd seen underground, confirming my worst fears. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered, tears cutting tracks through the coal dust on his cheeks. "I've been feeding them information about new workers for years. Names, backgrounds, where they're staying. I thought if I gave them what they wanted, they'd leave my family alone." "Your family?" Martha said. "Jimmy's still down there," Frank interrupted. "My brother-in-law, one of the 17. Sometimes in my dreams I hear him calling to me, telling me how peaceful it is in the dark, how much better things are without the burden of human worries." The truth hit me like a physical blow. The mining company wasn't just randomly hiring surveyors. They were being guided by something underground, something that needed fresh souls to maintain its growing congregation. Frank had been their recruiter, marking potential victims for entities that had learned to be patient predators. "They've marked you now," Frank continued, his voice hollow with despair. "Once they know your name, once they've touched your mind, there's no escaping. The only mercy is that fighting them just makes the conversion more painful." I spent that night researching ways to seal the mine permanently, but the shadows grew bolder with each passing hour. They manifested in broad daylight now, following me through town, whispering promises of eternal communion that made my skin crawl. The hunt had begun, and I was running out of time to escape becoming their next convert. I escaped Blackridge by stealing dynamite from the mining company's supply shed and collapsing the main entrance to Mercy Mine. The explosion echoed through the mountains like thunder, and for a moment the whispers stopped. I thought I'd won. I was wrong. Within weeks, I realized the entities had found other ways to reach the surface. Appalachia is riddled with natural cave systems that connect underground for hundreds of miles. Sealing one entrance was like plugging a single hole in a dam that was already cracking. The shadows followed me home to Pennsylvania. They manifest in my peripheral vision, moving wrong against walls that should cast normal shadows. I hear whispers in empty rooms, speaking that ancient language that bypasses my ears and speaks directly to something deeper in my brain. My apartment stays 20 degrees colder than it should, and mirrors reflect things that aren't there. But what terrifies me most are the job offers. They arrive weekly now, mining companies across Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, all offering lucrative positions surveying abandoned sites. Every letter is signed with the same precise handwriting, leading me back toward the darkness that waits beneath the mountains. They're patient. They can wait decades for the right moment to claim their marked souls. And I'm starting to understand that my escape from Blackridge was never an escape at all, just a longer leash before they reel me back into the eternal dark where I belong. I came to Hollow Creek with a simple mission: to document the dying folklore of isolated Appalachian communities for my doctoral thesis. What I found instead was something that would change my understanding of reality forever. The town appeared normal enough as I drove down the winding mountain road that October afternoon. Rustic cabins dotted the hillsides, smoke curling from stone chimneys, and the autumn leaves painted the landscape in brilliant reds and golds. But as the sun began to set, I noticed something deeply unsettling. Every single building in town was being fortified, not against storms or wild animals, but against something else entirely. I watched from my rental car as residents moved with practiced efficiency, hammering long iron nails through boards that covered every door and window. The sound echoed through the valley like gunshots, creating a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. When I approached a middle-aged man securing his front porch, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "You picked the wrong night to visit, stranger," he muttered, not pausing in his work. "Best find shelter quick, and whatever you do, don't listen to what you hear after dark." I pressed him for more information, but he just shook his head and repeated the same cryptic warning I'd hear all evening. The walking hunger comes with the darkness. The town's only guest house sat at the end of Main Street, a weathered Victorian structure that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The elderly woman who answered my knock studied me through thick glasses, her gnarled hands gripping the doorframe with white knuckles. "We don't usually take visitors this time of year," she said, her voice carrying the weight of mountain winters, especially not when the moon's dark like tonight. I explained my research, offering double her usual rate, and she finally stepped aside with obvious reluctance. "Name's Edith Crane," she said, leading me through a dimly lit hallway. "Been running this place for 43 years, and I've got one rule that ain't negotiable. Once them nails go in at sunset, nothing, and I mean nothing, gets opened until dawn. I don't care what you hear outside, what voices call your name, or what sounds like it's dying on my doorstep. You keep them barriers sealed tight, you understand me?" Her intensity sent chills down my spine, but I nodded agreement, thinking I was simply dealing with an eccentric local superstition. Sleep was impossible that first night. Around midnight, it started with gentle scratching at my second-floor window, like tree branches swaying in the wind. But there was no wind, and the nearest tree was 20 feet away. The scratching grew more deliberate, more rhythmic, until it sounded distinctly like fingernails dragging across glass. Then I heard my name. "David," came a voice from outside, soft and pleading. "David, please, I need help." My blood turned to ice. The voice belonged to my sister Sarah, who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. I knew that voice better than my own. Every inflection, every slight rasp from years of smoking. The way she always pronounced my name when she was scared or hurt. I crept to the window, my hands trembling as I reached for the heavy boards that covered it. Through a gap between the planks, I caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness below. Something pale shifted in the shadows, and with it came a smell so putrid it made my eyes water. It was the stench of decay, of meat left too long in the sun, of death itself. "Please, David," the voice continued, now tinged with desperation. "I'm so cold out here. Just let me in for a few minutes to warm up." Every instinct screamed at me to tear away those boards to help my sister, who sounded so lost and afraid. But Edith's warning echoed in my mind, and I forced myself to step back from the window. The scratching intensified, becoming frantic, and other voices joined Sarah's, neighbors from my childhood, my grandfather who'd passed last winter, even my college roommate who'd overdosed 5 years ago. By morning, I was convinced I was losing my mind. But daylight brought clarity and determination. I had to understand what was happening in this town. The Hollow Creek Public Library was a single room attached to the post office, run by a librarian who looked old enough to have personally witnessed the Civil War. When I explained my research interest, her expression grew troubled. "You're asking about things best left buried," she whispered, but eventually led me to a collection of local historical documents. What I found there changed everything. Hollow Creek had been established in 1847 on land that the Cherokee had considered sacred, a burial ground for their ancestors dating back centuries. The early settlers had desecrated the site, digging up graves to clear land for farming and dumping the remains in a mass pit outside town. According to journal entries from the town's first minister, the trouble started almost immediately. People began disappearing at night, lured outside by the voices of deceased loved ones. The Cherokee had a name for what haunted this place: the endless appetite. A force that consumed not just flesh, but the very essence of life itself, growing stronger with each victim and gaining the ability to perfectly mimic those it had devoured. Armed with historical context, I spent the next day approaching townspeople, though most scattered like startled deer when I mentioned my research. Finally, an elderly man named Thomas Whitaker agreed to speak with me, but only after I bought him 3 shots of whiskey at the town's only bar. "My grandmother told me stories," he said, his weathered hands shaking as he lifted his glass. "Said her own mama saw them things back in the 1890s. They come looking like folks you've lost, wearing their faces perfect as mirrors. But their eyes," he shuddered, "their eyes are hungry, like looking into empty wells that ain't never been filled." Thomas described how the entities would appear at windows and doors, crying and pleading to be let inside. They knew intimate details about their victims' lives, shared memories that only the real deceased person could have known. "They don't just look like the dead," he explained. "They become them somehow. Take their memories, their voices, everything that made them who they were." I pressed him about the iron nails, and his expression grew grim. "Ain't superstition, son. Iron burns them somehow, keeps them from crossing thresholds. My great-grandfather was a blacksmith, and he's the one figured it out. Before then, folks tried everything. Salt circles, holy water, burning sage. Nothing worked except cold iron. The most chilling story came from a woman named Betty Parsons, who eventually agreed to meet me after Thomas vouched for my intentions. Her hands never stopped trembling as she spoke. The Henderson family lived 3 houses down from us, she whispered. This was 1967, and they were new to town, didn't take our warnings serious. Little Mary Henderson was only 8 years old when it happened. According to Betty, the Hendersons had gotten complacent during a particularly quiet week in October. Mr. Henderson forgot to nail their front door shut before retiring, and around 3 in the morning someone began knocking. Mary's grandfather had died that summer. Betty continued. Cancer took him slow and painful, but there he was at their door looking healthy as the day he was born, begging to come in out of the cold. The parents knew something was wrong, but Mary slipped past them and opened the door before they could stop her. She was just a child who missed her granddaddy, Betty said, tears streaming down her cheeks. They found the Henderson parents the next morning, dried out like autumn leaves, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Mary survived only because she'd hidden in a closet, watching through the keyhole as something wearing her grandfather's face drained the life from her parents with its touch. She never spoke again after that night. Betty finished. Lives up in the state hospital now, been there 56 years. Sometimes she still screams about hungry eyes and empty wells. On my 3rd night in Hollow Creek, academic arrogance overrode common sense. Despite everything I'd learned, despite the warnings that had been passed down through generations, I needed proof. I needed to document what was happening here, to record evidence that would validate my research and maybe help others understand this phenomenon. So I made a decision that still haunts me. I deliberately left one window in my room unnailed. Edith had watched me with knowing eyes as I helped her secure the guest house that evening, hammering iron nails through boards with practiced efficiency. But she didn't see me quietly remove 3 nails from the bathroom window after she'd gone to bed. I positioned my camera on a tripod, checked my audio equipment, and settled in to wait. The first hour passed in silence so complete it felt oppressive. Then around 11:30 I heard the familiar scratching. But tonight it was different, more purposeful, more intelligent. Whatever was out there had found the one unsealed window in the entire building. David. The voice that came through the glass made my heart stop. It was my father, dead for 5 years from a heart attack, speaking with the same gentle tone he'd used to read me bedtime stories as a child. Son, I've been looking for you. I pressed my face against the glass, and there he was, standing in the moonlight exactly as I remembered him. Same brown hair with streaks of gray, same kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, even wearing the blue flannel shirt I'd buried him in. The sight of him brought tears to my eyes and an overwhelming urge to unlock that window. I'm so cold out here, David, he continued, and I could see his breath fogging in the night air, and so hungry. I haven't eaten in so long. Please just let me in for a few minutes. That's when my mother appeared beside him, looking exactly as she had the day she died in that hospital bed, but healthy again, vibrant. We've missed you so much, sweetheart, she said, pressing her palm against the glass. We've been waiting for you to find us. The smell hit me then, that same overwhelming stench of decay I'd experienced the first night, but magnified tenfold. It was so putrid I gagged, stumbling backward from the window, yet their voices remained sweet and loving, their faces expressions of genuine concern and longing. Something's wrong, I whispered to myself, fighting against the emotional pull. Something's very wrong, but their pleas grew more desperate, more heartbreaking. They talked about memories only my real parents could have known. My first day of school, the time I broke my arm falling from the old oak tree, the proud look on my father's face when I graduated college. Every detail was perfect, every inflection exactly right. When I still refused to open the window, their demeanor changed. The loving expressions twisted into something horrible, their faces contorting with rage. They began pounding on the glass with superhuman strength, cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. And as they struck the window, their human facades began to slip. I saw glimpses of what they really were, something ancient and hungry, with too many teeth and eyes like black holes. The stench of rotting flesh became unbearable, and I realized these weren't the spirits of the dead. These were something far older, far more malevolent, something that had been feeding on human misery for centuries, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. The assault on my window intensified, but I realized their true strategy wasn't brute force. It was psychological warfare. As the cracks spread across the glass, the creatures began cycling through every person I'd ever lost, each appearance more convincing and emotionally devastating than the last. My college roommate Jake appeared next, looking exactly as he had before the overdose, his face free of the gaunt desperation that had marked his final months. "Dude, remember that night we stayed up until dawn talking about changing the world?" he said with that same infectious grin. "I need you to let me in so we can finish that conversation. I've learned so much since I've been gone." Then came my grandmother, the woman who'd raised me after my parents' deaths, standing there in her favorite yellow dress with flour on her hands from making my birthday cake. "My sweet boy," she whispered, and I could almost smell her perfume through the glass. "I've been baking cookies for you, but they're getting cold. Won't you let your old grandma in to give you a proper hug?" Each transformation was flawless, each voice pitch perfect. They knew things only the real people could have known. Inside jokes, shared secrets, moments of intimacy that should have been impossible for anything else to replicate. The emotional manipulation was surgical in its precision, designed to exploit every grief, every regret, every moment of love I'd ever felt for these people. My resolve was crumbling. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for the window latch, my rational mind screaming warnings while my heart ached to embrace these lost souls one more time. The glass was spiderwebbed now, ready to shatter completely, and the creatures sensed my weakness. "Just open it a crack," my grandmother pleaded. "Just enough to touch your hand. I've missed you so much, sweetheart." My fingers closed around the latch. I was about to turn it when the bedroom door exploded inward. Edith Crane stood in the doorway, looking nothing like the frail elderly woman I'd met. She held a double-barreled shotgun with the confidence of someone who'd used it many times before, her nightgown billowing around her like a war banner. "Get away from that window, you fool," she barked, and fired both barrels at the glass. The sound was deafening in the small room, but what happened next defied explanation. Instead of buckshot, some kind of metallic fragments struck the creatures outside, and they let out inhuman shrieks that sounded like metal being torn apart. Their beautiful human disguises dissolved instantly, revealing something that my mind struggled to process: writhing shadows with too many limbs and mouths full of needle-sharp teeth. "Iron shot," Edith said grimly, reloading with practiced efficiency. "Only thing that really hurts them." The creatures retreated into the darkness, their howls echoing across the valley like a pack of wounded animals. Edith helped me nail fresh boards over the shattered window, her movements quick and sure despite her age. "You're Mary Henderson," I said suddenly, the pieces clicking together. "The little girl who survived in 1967, she nodded slowly. 67 years old now, but I still see their real faces every night in my dreams. These things, they've been getting stronger, more clever with each passing year. Used to be we could keep them out with simple iron nails. Now we need more. Blessed iron, cold iron, iron forged under specific conditions. They're adapting, learning from each failed attempt." She sat heavily in the room's single chair, the shotgun across her knees. "They killed my parents, consumed their essence, and now they wear their faces like masks whenever they want to hurt me. But I've spent my entire life learning how to fight them, and I'll be damned if I let them take anyone else. I left Hollow Creek at dawn, but not empty-handed. Mary insisted I help reinforce the town's defenses before departing, teaching me the proper way to bless iron nails and position them for maximum protection. Every resident contributed to a bag of specially prepared iron nails she pressed into my hands at the truck. "They've seen you now," she warned, her weathered face grave in the morning light. "The hunger follows those who witness it. You'll need these more than you think." I drove away convinced I was leaving a nightmare behind, but Mary's words proved prophetic. 3 months later, back in my Chicago apartment, the familiar scratching started at my windows. First came my parents' voices, then my grandmother's, all pleading to come inside from the cold. The stench of decay followed soon after. Now I spend my evenings hammering iron nails through boards, just like the people of Hollow Creek. But the most terrifying discovery came last week when I noticed my neighbors doing the same thing. Mrs. Chen across the hall, the college students upstairs, even the businessmen on the ground floor, all of us sealing our homes against something we can't quite explain to outsiders. The walking hunger isn't confined to remote mountain towns. It's spreading, adapting, learning. And I'm beginning to understand that Hollow Creek wasn't an isolated incident. It was patient zero for something much larger and more terrifying than any of us imagined. I'm telling you this story from my apartment in Nashville, 3 weeks after it happened, because I need someone else to know what's really lurking in those Appalachian Mountains. My hands still shake when I think about that night, about the sounds I heard in the darkness, about the things I saw that no rational person should ever have to witness. It started with something as mundane as a blown radiator hose on Highway 421, somewhere deep in the Kentucky mountains where cell towers are just a fantasy, and the nearest town might as well be on another planet. I was driving back from a client meeting in Hazard, taking what my GPS promised was a shortcut through the Daniel Boone National Forest. The kind of road that winds through hollows so deep you can't see the sky, where the trees grow so thick they block out the moon. When my engine started overheating, I pulled over onto what passed for a shoulder, nothing more than a narrow strip of gravel between the asphalt and a wall of impenetrable forest. The silence that hit me when I turned off the engine was absolute. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something heavier, more oppressive, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard the first sound. Not quite human, but not animal either. A low guttural noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the canyon walls in ways that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just wind through the trees, maybe a bear or a wild boar rooting around in the underbrush. But bears don't whistle back when you whistle at them. And they certainly don't move through the forest with the kind of deliberate, calculated steps that I heard circling my car in the pitch-black darkness. Something was out there in those woods, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment, something that knew I was alone, stranded, and completely at its mercy. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and popped the hood, trying to convince myself this was just a mechanical problem with a mechanical solution. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating steam rising from my engine like ghostly fingers reaching toward the canopy above. Simple radiator hose replacement, something I'd done dozens of times in my garage back home. But home felt like a different universe now. The rustling in the trees grew louder as I worked, branches snapping under the weight of something moving parallel to the road. I kept my flashlight trained on the engine, but my peripheral vision caught glimpses of shapes that seemed too tall, too angular to be wildlife. Every few minutes, that same guttural sound would echo through the hollow, answered by similar calls from different directions, like some primitive form of communication happening all around me. That's when my light beam swept across something that made my blood freeze. About 20 feet into the tree line, caught on a low branch, hung a tattered piece of fabric. Blue denim, faded and weathered but unmistakably from a pair of jeans. Below it, scattered across the forest floor, I could make out more debris. A single sneaker, its white leather stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. A backpack torn open, its contents scattered and picked clean. The trees themselves bore evidence of violence. Deep gouges in the bark, too regular to be from animal claws, too savage to be from any tool I recognized. Some of the scratches formed patterns that almost looked deliberate, like territorial markings or warnings carved by something that understood the concept of intimidation. My flashlight began to dim, the beam weakening as the battery drained. I tapped it against my palm, coaxing a few more minutes of illumination from the failing bulb. But I knew I was running out of time. In the growing darkness, those sounds in the forest were getting closer, more confident, as if whatever was out there could sense my vulnerability. Then came the whistling, not the random notes of wind through leaves, but something with rhythm, with purpose. A series of ascending and descending tones that seemed to come from multiple sources, weaving together into a melody that raised every hair on the back of my neck. It sounded almost like a song, like a hunting call passed between pack members who had found their prey. I abandoned any pretense of fixing the car and focused on the only thing that mattered now, staying alive until sunrise. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and popped the hood, trying to convince myself this was just a mechanical problem with a mechanical solution. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating steam rising from my engine like ghostly fingers reaching toward the canopy above. Simple radiator hose replacement, something I'd done dozens of times in my garage back home. But home felt like a different universe now. The rustling in the trees grew louder as I worked, branches snapping under the weight of something moving parallel to the road. I kept my flashlight trained on the engine, but my peripheral vision caught glimpses of shapes that seemed too tall, too angular to be wildlife. Every few minutes, that same guttural sound would echo through the hollow, answered by similar calls from different directions, like some primitive form of communication happening all around me. That's when my light beam swept across something that made my blood freeze. About 20 feet into the tree line, caught on a low branch, hung a tattered piece of fabric. Blue denim, faded and weathered but unmistakably from a pair of jeans. Below it, scattered across the forest floor, I could make out more debris, a single sneaker, its white leather stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. A backpack torn open, its contents scattered and picked clean. The trees themselves bore evidence of violence. Deep gouges in the bark, too regular to be from animal claws, too savage to be from any tool I recognized. Some of the scratches formed patterns that almost looked deliberate, like territorial markings or warnings carved by something that understood the concept of intimidation. My flashlight began to dim, the beam weakening as the battery drained. I tapped it against my palm, coaxing a few more minutes of illumination from the failing bulb, but I knew I was running out of time. In the growing darkness, those sounds in the forest were getting closer, more confident, as if whatever was out there could sense my vulnerability. Then came the whistling, not the random notes of wind through leaves, but something with rhythm, with purpose, a series of ascending and descending tones that seemed to come from multiple sources, weaving together into a melody that raised every hair on the back of my neck. It sounded almost like a song, like a hunting call passed between pack members who had found their prey. I abandoned any pretense of fixing the car and focused on the only thing that mattered now, staying alive until sunrise. Just when I thought I couldn't take another second of that haunting melody echoing through the trees, voices called out from the darkness. Human voices, speaking English with thick mountain accents that somehow made every word sound both welcoming and threatening. "You having some trouble there, friend?" The voice belonged to a tall, gaunt man who materialized from the forest like he'd been carved from the shadows themselves. Behind him came 3 others, all moving with the silent confidence of people who knew these woods better than their own homes. They carried no flashlights, no lanterns, yet navigated the pitch-black terrain without hesitation. "Engine trouble," I managed, my voice cracking with relief and residual fear. "Radiator hose blew out. I've been stuck here for over an hour." The tall man nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting what little light remained from my dying flashlight in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of nocturnal predators. "Hour, you say?" "That's about right. Things get restless after an hour. You picked a bad stretch of road to break down on, city boy." How did he know I was from the city? I hadn't mentioned it. Hadn't even spoken to another human being since leaving Hazard. But before I could ask, one of the others stepped forward, a woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that looked like they'd spent decades working with tools and dirt. "Lucky we came along when we did," she said, though her tone suggested luck had nothing to do with it. "The hungry time's starting soon, and this here's feeding ground. Old agreements got to be kept, you understand?" I didn't understand, not at all, but something in their manner discouraged questions. They spoke in hushed tones among themselves, using words that sounded like English but carried meanings just beyond my comprehension. "Grack," one whispered, and another nodded grimly. "Bargain's still good," the tall man said, "but we got to move him before the calling gets stronger." "Move me where?" I asked. But they were already gathering my belongings from the car, handling my possessions with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. "Got a place up the mountain where you'll be safe," the tall man explained, shouldering my overnight bag without asking. "Can't leave you here for the night. Things in these woods don't take kindly to strangers after dark, but our settlement, well, we got ways of keeping the old spirit satisfied." The way he said satisfied made my skin crawl, but what choice did I have? My car was dead, my phone useless, and whatever had been circling me in the darkness was still out there. I followed them into the forest, each step taking me further from the road and deeper into a wilderness that felt increasingly hostile with every passing moment. We walked for what felt like hours, through terrain that shouldn't have existed on any government survey. The path wound deeper into the mountain through passages between rock formations that seemed to close behind us as we passed. When we finally emerged into a clearing, I found myself staring at something that defied everything I knew about modern America. The settlement looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1850. Rough-hewn, log cabins surrounded a central fire pit where figures moved in the flickering light, their shadows dancing against structures that had been built without a single nail or piece of modern hardware. But it was the people that made my blood run cold. Too many people for such a remote location, all watching me with expressions that mixed curiosity with something that looked disturbingly like hunger. "Welcome to Grack Hollow," the tall man announced, and the gathered crowd murmured approval in voices that carried accents from decades I couldn't place. Another lost traveler delivered right on schedule. That's when I noticed them among the faces illuminated by firelight. A young woman wearing clothes from the 1980s. Her missing person photo probably yellowed with age in some police station filing cabinet. An elderly man whose vintage suit suggested he'd been collected sometime in the 1960s. Children who should have been adults by now if time moved normally in this place, all staring at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Don't look so frightened," whispered a woman who stepped from the shadows. She wore a business suit that had been fashionable 15 years ago, and I recognized her face from a news story I'd half remembered about a lawyer who'd vanished while driving through eastern Kentucky. "We're all family here now. The mountain takes care of those who serve its needs." An ancient woman, bent nearly double with age, approached carrying a wooden bowl filled with some dark liquid that steamed in the cool mountain air. "Drink," she commanded, and though every instinct screamed against it, the others formed a circle around me that made refusal impossible. The covenant demands proper welcome. Newcomers must be prepared for what's expected. The liquid burned like fire going down, but immediately my head began to clear in ways that terrified me. I could hear things now that hadn't been audible before. Whispers in the wind that sounded almost like words. Footsteps moving through the forest in patterns too regular to be natural. And underneath it all, a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the mountain itself, like some massive creature breathing in the darkness far below our feet. "Every generation, the mountain calls for tribute," the tall man explained, his earlier friendliness replaced by ceremonial formality. "We've honored that calling for over 2 centuries. Kept our bargain, kept our people safe, and travelers like you, well, you help us maintain the old agreements that keep worse things from waking up." As the moon disappeared behind thick clouds, the true horror of my situation became clear. The settlement transformed from an eerie historical curiosity into something far more sinister. The residents formed a procession, carrying torches and chanting in that strange dialect that seemed to predate any known language. At the center of their formation, they placed me on a wooden platform that had been stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. "The Grack has slept long enough," the ancient woman proclaimed, her voice carrying across the hollow with unnatural strength. "2 winters without proper feeding and it grows restless. The bargain our ancestors made requires fresh blood, fresh life force to keep it satisfied and contained within the deep places." The tall man approached carrying a blade that looked older than the settlement itself, its metal black with age and use. "Nothing personal, friend, but the mountain takes what the mountain needs. Your sacrifice ensures our survival for another season, keeps the Grack from wandering down to the valleys where your people live." But as the ritual reached its climax, something went wrong. The torches began flickering and dying one by one despite the still night air. The chanting faltered as confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone had been sabotaging their ceremony, weakening the protective circles they'd drawn in the dirt around the platform. A figure emerged from the darkness behind the nearest cabin, and I recognized the missing lawyer from the news story. "Run!" she screamed, throwing something that scattered the ritual implements. "I've been breaking their protections for months. The barriers are weakened, but that thing down there is waking up." The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and from somewhere deep within the mountain came a sound that wasn't quite roar, wasn't quite scream, but something infinitely worse. The settlement residents scattered in panic as fissures opened in the earth, releasing a stench of decay and ancient malevolence that made my eyes water. "The automobile trail. Follow the creek downstream," the lawyer shouted as we ran through the chaos. "I've been mapping escape routes, but we have to move fast. When the Grack realizes it's been denied its tribute, it'll come hunting." Behind us, the settlement erupted in inhuman screams as something enormous began forcing its way up from the depths. Trees cracked and fell as the very mountain reshaped itself around the awakening entity. We crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs, guided only by starlight and desperation, while the sounds of pursuit grew closer with every passing second. The covenant was broken, the ancient agreement shattered, and now something that had slumbered for generations was loose in the Appalachian wilderness, hungry and furious at being denied its promised meal. We made it to the main highway just as dawn broke over the ridge, flagging down a trucker who took one look at our torn clothes and terrified faces and didn't ask questions. The lawyer, whose name was Sarah Chen, had been trapped in that hollow for 3 years, slowly working to undermine their rituals while pretending to be another broken victim. She saved my life, but we both knew our escape came at a terrible price. The settlement was gone when search and rescue teams finally investigated our story. Nothing but empty forest where dozens of people had lived in their twisted covenant with something ancient and hungry. The authorities found my car exactly where I'd left it, but the radiator hose was perfectly intact, engine running smooth as silk, no evidence of the trail we'd followed into the mountains, no sign that Grok Hollow had ever existed, but the entity followed us out. I see it in my reflection sometimes, a shadow that moves independently of my body. Sarah started having seizures 2 weeks after our escape, speaking in that strange dialect during fits that leave her exhausted and terrified. We're marked now, forever changed by our contact with something that shouldn't exist in our rational world. The mountain folk are still out there, rebuilding their settlement, seeking new travelers to replace what they lost. Sometimes I get calls with nothing but heavy breathing and distant whistling. Sometimes I find footprints in the mud outside my apartment that don't belong to any local wildlife. So here's my warning. Avoid those mountain roads after dark. Don't trust helpful strangers who emerge from forests with too much knowledge about your situation. And if your car breaks down in the deep hollows of Appalachia, remember that some places exist outside the boundaries of our civilized world. Once they mark you, once you've seen what lives in the spaces between reality, you never really escape. You just learn to live with the knowledge that something ancient and patient is always watching, always waiting for the right moment to collect what it believes you owe. The mountains have long memories and they never forget a debt.